Buenos días a todas y a todos y bienvenidos a esta segunda parte de la segunda jornada.
Greetings to all of you and welcome to this second session in the afternoon in the doctoral seminar, Peace and European Values as a Potential Model for Integration and Progress in a Global World. We will have a new panelist, which will be moderated by the director of the foundation, Juan Carlos Moreno, who's also a member of the jury of these grants. Thank you. Good afternoon. I welcome in this podium to Mayte and Santiago. Mayte, you can see her. Santiago is inside her. But we should also welcome the other one. I mean, we have to welcome both of them. Mayte is already a doctor by the Freie University of Berlin for past few days, and I believe that her son is almost a doctoral student, because if he's been with her for this month, she was telling me during the lunch that when she ate sweets, Santiago responded in her womb. And what happened when you read books? Well, probably the same. So this is a very friendly introduction, and I will give her the floor so that she can speak to us on a very interesting topic, which is so much close to our foundation, which will turn to be European and Ibero-American very soon. The topic is the European model, democracy and human rights in the cooperation with Latin America in the early 90s. You have the floor, Mayte.
Buenas tardes.
Good afternoon. The European model is the title that was coined by me. This presentation is not my PhD, it's just part of my PhD. It's a speech or a discourse that I follow along the years, and I thought it was appropriate to present it here today. What I would like to talk to you about is the fruit of a bibliographical revision and EU archives and files since 1987 and 1994 that allowed me to observe that during these years there was a constant discourse on European values in EU policy towards Latin America. As you can see on the screen, I mention official documents and classified documents because I not only used published documents, but I also asked for permission to have access to draft document on the different decisions that were taken by the EU during the 90s. So I follow the first motion, that was to open a dialogue with a group of Rio, and then I follow all the documents until the dialogue was launched. It is important to mention that even though I did an analysis of these 7 years, 1987 until 1994, I also mentioned that it is the 90s discourse, because what happened in the 1980s had an impact on what happened on the 90s. The European model is what I call, and it is the discourse that highlights democratic and human rights value, as well as knowledge transfer in diverse areas that has been linked to re-democratization in Latin America, and is also linked to common ties and the idea of demand in Europe. And I will explain later on what I mean by the demand of Europe. As I was saying, the European model it's in the context of my PhD, a cross-versal discourse. My objective was to follow the EU discourse on democracy and human rights and see the links of the decisions that were taken with regard to Latin America at the beginning of the 90s. Because up until then, Latin America was not a specific issue of the EU. And since 1976, it was included together with Africa and Asia in the decisions that were taken. Then some African countries were part of the APC, that is Africa, Caribbean, and the Pacific. Then we only had the Latin America stage and also Asia. And what I did was to separate what were the decisions taken on Asia and those on Latin America, which is what I focused on. My objective, as I said, was to know what type of EU speech and discourse was being done on democracy and human rights. And it's linked with Latin America. What are the theoretical tools that I chose? Well, I chose to see my PhD from a discursive institutionalism. What tries to do this approach is to have a discourse, once again, to try and understand how changes are being made. This theoretical perspective allows us to analyze discourses in the framework of an institutional change. From that perspective, the discourse means the representation of ideas, that is how agents say what they're thinking on doing, and discursive interactions through which actors generate and communicate ideas. This is an idea that was proposed by Smith in 2004. What does that mean with regard to the EU and the community scene? Well, we need to take into account both the discursive coalitions and what are the different institutional contexts among the different institutions of the EU. So the discourse needs to have not only the ideas, but also needs to be taken into account, as I said, the institutional context. By this context, I mean the where, when, how, and why of what has been said. That it is the big arena where all of the factors are there so that the ideas are turned into practice or not. And that context, that's what is decisive so that a discourse is successful and some other discourse with similar ideas is not. What about the actors of this discursive institutionalism? Well, they generate political ideas and arguments with different degrees and types of influence. Of course, the council has more power because it's more influential actor than parliamentaries with regard to foreign policy. And that, I think, is obvious not just on the policy with regard to Latin America, but in general. Another important concept is that of discursive coalitions. These coalitions are groups with different actors that try to have an influence and an impact in the generation, configuration, and adoption of policies. It is important to say that the members of these coalitions do not always share the same ideology or beliefs or interests. However, these actors are the ones who win or lose through their discourses, and through that, if they win, their discourse become a policy. Let's talk now about content itself. I would like to start by talking about what happened even before 1987, because this is an important time in history. First, because there was a certain distancing or estrangement among both regions, Europe and Latin America, from the beginning of the 20th century. Latin American quota in Europe declined over the course of last century. That was just one example. This estrangement was first because of the First and Second World War, because the United States is the first trading partner instead of the Europeans. And that was consolidated after the Second World War, including Latin America. The United States, especially after the Second World War, it played an important role in order to understand the relationship between the European Union or Europe and Latin America. Because we're talking about what was happening in Europe, there were a lot of problems here, and there was lack of freedom, and there was lack of economic perspectives, and that's what happened as well in Latin America, because at the time they could not ignore the United States. Rather, they depended to a great extent to what the US were doing. So on the two sides, both Europe and Latin America had to take into account what was happening in the US. Then there was another factor for this detachment, and it was the European integration, because they needed to rebuild their countries. And so that meant that they were in debt as well. Also, the economic policies did not favor Latin America because it was not a priority. Priority were member states. And with regard to foreign policy, they were concerned about neighboring countries or the former colonies. And Spain and Portugal at that time, in 1957, they were not part of this European community, so Latin America was not taken into account. It was not a former colony of any of the members. In Latin America, they could not have access to the different trade agreements. Funny thing, they tried to do so, to have some preferential trade agreements at the time, but the United States was opposed to that. And so the European community listened to what the United States said. So we need to understand the European point of view, but also the Latin America point of view. Those years saw an increase of military dictatorship, usually on the right, but in Peru, for instance, it was a leftish government, and that also distanced both communities, because the European community, they wanted to strike some ties with democracies, of course. And then we also have the model of substitution through imports that favored domestic trade instead of exports. However, it's important to mention that these Latin American dictatorships, they did not completely erase the interests of Europeans towards this region in Latin America. Why? Well, there was a political opposition that was limited, but it was also welcomed by the European Parliament. In 1974, for instance, the European Parliament started a dialogue with the Latin American Parliament as a response to what happened in the end of the 1960s, because the Parliament requested the Council to open some sort of dialogue with Latin America. And the Council did not respond. The Parliament could ask for something, and then the answer came 20 years later, and it was a chaos. So they decided to open this space themselves, and that was very important, because European political parties have very strong ties with the parties in Latin America. And it's not just the left-wing parties, but also the right-wing ones. And we see that through different regions where parliamentarians have a lot of links. That meant also that those parliamentarians that were expelled, like Allende's government, were invited to interparliamentary talks as observers. Now let's see the opposite movement, that is the rapprochement, how they started seeing each other and talking to each other. The main factors in the 1980s were what I mentioned before, the Latin American redemocratization. This democratic wave was stronger in the 1990s, and from then on it became a global movement, but it started in the 80s in Latin America, so an interest had begun back then. That also went together with the redemocratization in the south of Europe, especially in Spain. They were interested in having these ties bound with Latin America, and so they were the driving force for it. Then we had the Iberian access to the European community, that is Portugal and Spain coming into the Union. Why? Well, because Latin American countries were not just third countries, but rather they were considered former colonies. And by having that that consideration, they were one step closer to strike good relations. And then a cross-versal factor as well is how integration, regional integration of the EU was integrated with their relationships with different regions, and also with Latin America. This is not just something that happened in Latin America. As I will say later on, dialogue started with all regions and also with Latin America. In the 90s, we have a peak moment, which was the transformation, the structural transformation of Latin American economies, because in the 1980s we have the debt crisis that hindered dialogue on the side not of all European actors, but at least a few of them did not want to intervene or dialogue with Latin American countries about the debt. I will mention that later once again. But in the 90s, there was a neoliberal change in the region, and that provoked private operators to become interested in this region, and at the same time, the EU community took note of that interest, and they wanted to implement some economic tools that boosted contact. The goal was to facilitate intervention of those private operators, of course. And then we have, on the other hand as well, the regional integration of Latin America. In the 1980s, there were many problems, like the debt crisis, as I said, and there was an effort on integration in Latin America. First, it was the dialogue of San Jose and the conflict in Central America, but then the Contador group and the support group, the Grupo de Apoyo, and the Rio group, they represented almost all Latin American countries. And that meant that other regional groups were rethought, as happened in the 1990s. It was the Andean group and became the Andean community, and then Mercosur later on. With regard to Grupo de Rio, it was seen, and that is something that I got in the files, these exact words. They were a counterpart and a valid interlocutor, this Grupo de Rio, because there were countries that were trying to build a democracy, a multilateral system, and regional integration. These were the goals. On a parallel side, it was a low-cost dialogue. What does that mean? Well, it was a forum, mechanism of political cooperation in Latin America. It did not meant that there was any type of negotiation. It was not binding for Europeans. And so that did not threaten the sovereignty of any country, so it was readily accepted, first on an informal basis. Besides that, the European community was trying to have more of an international presence because they wanted to be more present in the world, Europe. This is a quote of the Commission in 1986, is the reivindication of the European identity at the international arena. Then this redemocratization reinforced the idea within the community that the Western values were still alive, very much alive in Latin America. So the way I see democracy is as a factor of distancing and also rapprochement. As we saw when dictatorships were in Latin America, there was a certain detachment. And I see that as a particular feature between Latin America and the European community. Why? Well, because despite the official discourse of the community was about having links with all pro-democratic countries, in the case of Latin America, they're especially strict with these countries. As Deputy Garcia Arias used to say, she's actually Spanish, but she was born in Mexico, and she also participated in topics dealing with Latin America. She says, when we ask all countries in the world to at least have respect for human rights, we ask Latin American countries to have democratic institutions. That is, they were asking more of Latin Americans. More than, for instance, than was being asked from Africa or the Mediterranean countries. I would like to mention two debates as example that I analyzed in my PhD, where democracy and that model of discourse was born in order to lay the foundations of a political decisions, and it was used by a discursive coalition. First, the case of the debt crisis. Two discursive coalitions were created. The first one was built by most delegations in the Council, by the European Parliament and by the Commission, added to those Latin Americans that were asking for a dialogue on debt. In fact, the Commission opened an informal and parallel dialogue, but they did not have the power to negotiate or say anything, so it did not last even a year. And on the other hand, there were three delegations that said that they would not allow to have open and space to discuss debt. It was the UK, the Netherlands, and Germany. Given the formal rules that are in the Council, if three delegations are against this paragraph, it meant that no dialogue could be open. Not just negotiations, but no dialogue could be started. What's interesting there is that the losing discursive coalition stated that crisis and cuts threaten democracy in Latin America, and the other coalition said that it was not an economic problem, but rather a political one. And so that's why we need to have a dialogue. So it's interesting to see how they use democracy in order to have a different type of dialogue. It was not successful, but it's important to mention that. Another debate was about democracy, where the new proportions for cooperation with Asia and Latin America. Asia and Latin America, as we said before, they were together when it came to cooperation of the European community, and the budget was the same for both. And so it was Latin America 25% of funds and 75% for Asia. In this framework, thanks to a parliamentarian move, they managed to increase that amount from 25% to 35%. One of the arguments was that Portugal and Spain were inside the European community, and that is why the budget had to be increased. But at the same time, what was being said was that the increase of these funds for Latin America was important to support the democratical context, since the military governments were ending in Latin America. Next, I would like to have a link between the discourse and political decisions in the field of democracy. First of all, we have the institutionalization of dialogue with the Rio group after the Rome Declaration, where so what the community did for the first 3 years of informal dialogue, so to speak, it did not want to make it formal because they were not really convinced. But in 1990, after Chile had a democracy once again, or Paraguay as well, also because the Rio group added those groups that were democracies, and a Caribbean and a Central American country, that made it interesting for the community to start a political dialogue with this Rio group. Latin America is the region that has the highest number of integration group in the world, or at least attempt. There were many possibilities, but they decided to go with the Rio group. It was also important, and it was decided because it had a non-binding political nature. One of the important topics here, and one of the important ideas, is that one of the main issues, both of the Rome Declaration and the meetings between Rio and the European community, was the support of representative democracy, the rule of law, and the support to a political and commercial system that was to be multilateral and more open. And I highlight the political and commercial nature of the system. In words of the ad hoc group, the Council on Latin America in 1987, they called it promising evolutions. And those promises, those promising evolutions made it worth the effort. This had consequences on some decisions, but also it had an effect on the community organizational discourse as a whole. And that was at the beginning of the 1990s. So we have the declaration of the European Council of the 29th of June and the resolution of the Council of the EU members of the 28th of November 1991, where they mention that Latin American countries were back to democracy. One important idea that I found while I was researching on this discourse was that of common ties. Both on the budget debate, as I mentioned it earlier, and on others. For instance, it was said that Japan was reinforcing aid with Asian countries, and they said because they had ethical and cultural ties. And so it was said that the European community had to prioritize Latin America because its roots were found in Spain and Portugal. The parliamentarian that said so was Rabetke in 1987, and that's interesting because she was a German woman that was defending Iberian interests. Going back to our Iberian interests, from the Iberian integration point of view, they try to highlight and reinforce traditional links of both communities, because it was traditionally said that because of history, both regions should have closer ties. In that same regard, it's important to mention what Carlos Westendorp, former Minister for Foreign Affairs in Spain, in Spanish actually, 1996, he said that, and I quote, "In 1986, the European community discovers Latin America, and since then it has been reinforcing this dimension of its foreign projection. From the European Union, we have a higher presence and influence in Latin America, and thanks to our Ibero-American dimension, we also have a stronger weight and power in Brussels." That's in the end of quote. So it came from both sides. On the one hand, they wanted to reinforce the Latin American policy through European channels, which also which reinforced its presence and also used the resources of Latin America because they were the image in Latin America. On the other hand, it meant that for Spain, it meant that it had more power as being the bridging nation that was in the middle of dialogue of both areas. This story and this history of the link was based on a community of values and interest. By quoting some of the comments that I found. Among both regions, it was said that they shared the same conception of what meant to be a society and what were human rights, and that meant that they had a common vision on how the world should be organized. That was the basis that came especially from the European Parliament. That was a constant idea. It was an idea that I found from 1984, 87, and 1994 on the basis document for Latin America that did not include Asia anymore, and that is why this document, this basic and basis document, is the very beginning because it was dedicated just to that region, not to Asia. And it was important to include this issue because most of the topics that were discussed on this document had to do with democracy, human rights, and the disarmament with all the conflicts in Latin America. And it was mentioned there that the countries and the peoples of both regions had a lot of common roots from a historical, cultural, and spiritual point of view, and that they share values and ideas of freedom, human rights, solidarity, and the rule of law. Two things that caught my attention were, first of all, the spiritual ones, because it's the first time that I found a reference to this spiritual common root, and also solidarity, because it was being criticized the link between cooperation, development, and this type of economic cooperation. In 1992, economic cooperation was included, and there was an internal criticism, mostly from the socialist MPs, who questioned the goal of cooperation, whether it was just solidarity or whether it was a mutual interest. This mutual interest was the basis for economic cooperation. This economic cooperation was sold as a mutual interest, and that's what I said that caught my attention. During those years, cooperation was rethought, and that was linked to the European presence and the re-democratization that I already mentioned. I've been talking for a long time, so I'm going to cut it short. First, the community external role. They reflected on all forms of cooperation, and aid was adapted, and there was a widening of issues. Environment, drugs were added to cooperation, but what is interesting is the relevance of democracy and human rights in this document. Also, economic cooperation became, during these years, on the pillar and the basis of relationships. That was in competence with the US and Japan. That was the argument to also increase the cooperation with Japan. In this economical debate, they requested of Latin America of political stability. And that also became an important factor. Also, democracy was seen as stability. And so they requested Latin American countries to have stable democracies. The list of beneficiaries was also increased. Before, it was just one list, and those countries received the aid. With the case of Paraguay and Chile, who came back to democracy, a debate started. Like, what do we do? Do we include them in this list? In the case of Paraguay, the Commission wanted to include that country. Chile came in the same package, but Paraguay did not cause any debate because it was a poor country, but Chile was wealthier, and so it was up for debate. In the end, cooperation was open to all, but it was focused. They focused development cooperation to the less advanced Latin American countries. Democratic reserve was also included in this cooperation, and a debate started. There were those who thought that this cooperation should also be given to democratic countries. Some others thought that, well, there are poor people everywhere, and so we cannot just risk and not help poor people just because they do not live in democratic countries. And so they make an exception with those beneficiaries who were targeting poor people. They assigned different resources. There was a community support to those countries who were more engaged in favor of human rights, and there was a limitation to those who infringed and violated these rights. There was also reinforcement of coordination with the member countries and international institutions. We tried to cooperate at different levels and to show some lessons learned. These were two ideas that were seen jointly and were that laid the foundation for the discourse in the community. This coordination at the same time reinforced the European presence. The Commission saw that this idea was seen as an exemplary idea of growth and stability, and that it had generated a greater, as they call it, demand of Europe. It also expressed a trend in several regions that saw the European community as a model, among them Latin America. For instance, Alejandro Foxley, the Ministry of Treasury in Chile, said, and I quote, that they wanted to follow the European experience and the most industrialized countries. They wanted to rethink the integration, taking into account the community experience. Also, it shows how the Commission thought of what was being requested of it, of itself. Sorry, the European community had a new image of itself, and that was related to the knowledge transfer. So they were trying to transfer knowledge not just on democracy and human rights, but also in the fields of economy and technical knowledge transfer. Through this attempt in 1994, the European community wanted to project its own principle on liberal democracy, the cultural values, and the rule of law, not just in Latin America, but especially there, because the European community was seen as a model. Some final ideas. I think I have 8 more minutes. I did not call these conclusions because I wanted to foster debate, and I call it the European model in context. Why in context? Well, because this is just one of the discourses that I analyzed on my PhD. So if we want to understand it correctly, we need to compare it and to find a balance among all of the different discourses and see which one weights the most. So I call it an impulse, like a driving force in discourse of the community decisions. It was not just a common one, but it was constant, and it generated a debate. It did not cause an issue or a problem, but most people thought that this democracy model had to be accepted. However, this discourse was not self-explanatory. It was not enough to explain how policies were being done, because the discourse started at the end of the 1980s, but it was done in the 1990s. So what happened in the 90s so that this discourse became more relevant in the international context and international relations? Well, first of all, what happened was the end of the bipolar world with two big superpowers and the reassessment of the European role, the integration process that was done at the same time, and also an assessment of a specific region and debate with all of them. This was added to the economic structural changes in Latin America, as I said at the beginning. And we have to think as well that there were some different economic structural changes in the world, like the fall of the Berlin Wall. Not just the US won as a superpower, but an ideology also won in the world, especially because at the end of the 1980s there was an increase of power of the economy of the European countries, and then they also suffer some sort of crisis. Here it's important to mention, I think, that to me, the decisive factors are on the economic field and community integration. The role of Spain was the following. First, it had political and economic interest. Spain did not have the political power and the economic power as Germany had. So it focused more on policies. And in this framework, special attention was being paid to the socialist Latin American region. Not just Spanish socialist, but all of that region. But especially the Spanish ones were the ones that were constantly requesting the council to answer the questions. Spain also used Latin America as a testing ground for their companies that became more international, and then they came back to Europe with more experience. I also wanted to mention the role of another actor, Italy. Italy was the political partner before the Iberian integration for Latin America. When Spain came into the Union, Italy left Spain in charge, so to speak, and then it supported the group of Spain, Portugal, and Greece. Greece is like always at the end in this coalition. And then on the other hand, on the discursive coalition that was against giving resources to Latin America, we had the United Kingdom, because they had interest elsewhere, so they did not want to lose the funding that went to other countries. With regard to Germany, policies are different when it comes to its links with Latin America, but it is interesting because Germany was always, almost always, the strongest business partner, except when Spain was more important for a while, but then in the 2000s once again it became more important. But at an international level, it was not a political partner, only the business partner. So Germany was in between discourses. Sometimes it supported Spain, sometimes it did not. To finish my presentation, that discourse has to be understood within the framework of an evolution of the discourse itself. This idea was developed all along my PhD, and I saw how the discourse was not static, it was constantly evolving and has to be understood all along the time. That evolution, it also had to do with the view of Latin America as a specific region, an heterogeneous region, and at the time they wanted to be seen as a region and to highlight the differences with Asia or Africa, for instance. That was not something exclusive of the relationships with Latin America, but it was particularly so. Why did that happen? Well, first of all, it was more relevant, as we said before, but also because of what was the view of Latin America about it. and we had to add the Latin American integration. And that meant that there were many factors that meant that this discourse was the perfect breeding ground. Then we also have to mention that there were some general policies that were applied to Latin America. As we said, in the 90s, the Democratic Reserve, that was also applied in the 1990s, or the political dialogue that was part of a whole set of dialogues with other regions in the world, like, for instance, the 1990s, the reinforcement of dialogue with the Mediterranean countries that was also promoted by Spain because it had special interest in it. To me, these ideas are interesting because they were very relevant for Latin America as well. For the European Community, or now the EU, we are not a priority, but for Latin America, the EU is very important, is very relevant, is the most important partner for development and for other areas for many Latin American countries. So that's something we should take into account. Also, that takes me to why did I choose that topic? At a certain time, I worked as a civil society, and I was dealing with the free trade agreement between the Andean countries and the European Community, the European Union. And there was a contrast between what was expected from Latin America to Europe, what Latin America expected of Europe and what Europe delivered. And one common comment that I remember was the following: the EU at the end behaves the same as the United States. With regard to economic cooperation, negotiating with the US or the EU was pretty similar. And that was a shock, that came as a shock to Latin Americans, because for civil society in Latin America, the European Union was the model to follow for democracy and rights, and the fact that those ideas were not defended in agreements, that was a shock. For instance, some regulations with regard to the workforce or the protection of the rights of workers, and those who negotiated for the European Union, they did not want to accept it. They said, well, in European companies, a pregnant lady sometimes is fired just because she's pregnant, or there is an abuse when they're working extra hours. And so they try to protect labor force and workforce rights, and that was not guaranteed. And civil society were, well, as I said, a shock. It came as a shock because they expected more from the European Union. And I would like to end by saying, what do I not discuss in my paper, which are the consequences of this speech in Latin America, and also the implementation of this discourse, where were the policies that were implemented in Latin America as a consequence of this discourse and these closer ties. That is something that I have not researched, but I think it would be interesting to do so.
Muy bien, Mayte.
Very good, Mayte. Thank you very much for your presentation. Before opening the debate, I have taken a few notes while you were speaking that I will try to recover with certain coherence to finish up with a question. There are notes which are a reflection that I will try to make it as a contribution to complete what you didn't have the time to complete. These are very general comments without going into the details. The title of your presentation and I refer to the end, at the beginning of the 90s, and you have spoken between 87 and 94. How was in those days, with broad points, the world in those days? In Latin America, 1989, Paraguay; 1992, Peru and Venezuela, military interventions. Secondly, drug trafficking. Third, stagnated economy with a huge external debt. Fourth, a crisis which was not of an economic nature, but it was above all structural. A deficient educational system, agrarian structures which were archaic, and an industry which was lacking competitiveness. You have mentioned in one of your slides the Group of Rio. I remember right now a document of the Group of Rio. I can't remember whether it was from 1988 or 1992, but I remember the sentence which said, how much poverty can be sustained by freedom? And this is a phrase that was repeated, if I'm not wrong, Raoul Alfonsine to François Mitterrand when the latter visited Argentina. How much poverty can be sustained by freedom? This was in Latin America. What happened in those years in Europe? Three historical facts of a significant nature. 19th of November 1989, the fall of the Berlin Wall. Second, perestroika, which started with the election of Gorbachev in 1985. It was a little earlier, yes, the period that you have studied, but the effects of perestroika developed under this period. And thirdly, 1992, Maastricht. Does this mean that Latin America was going towards the cliff and that we were turning into an area of a brilliant future? Well, not necessarily, but this is interesting to have it in mind, because these differentiated worlds entail a great mutual ignorance. I wouldn't say that they despise each other, but they ignored each other. And relations between both parts of the world were at a very short term. There were not future plans. There was a great distance. It was a physical distance. In those days when internet didn't exist, or if it existed, it was not popularized. Distance was even bigger because communications were more difficult in those days. But above all, there was a great emotional distance. The ties between the Netherlands and Latin American countries was very little, and not so much perhaps with Spain, Portugal and Italy. You mentioned in Spain a very important moment, which is 1982, when Felipe González is appointed as president of the government, who stayed from 82 until 96. If I am mentioning him, is because he covers parts of your period. It is a personal idea that I have, which I don't know whether others may share. For me, Felipe González was chosen as president of the government of Spain with 40 years of age. When he was 25, May 68 happened in France, but 1 year before, Che Guevara had died. So we have two myths: Che Guevara, Latin America, May 68 in France, with little difference. Che Guevara died in around November 87. I beg your pardon, 67, and May was in May 68 was the movement in Paris. So the policy of approach of rapprochement, I think Che Guevara waited more in Latin America. There's a quotation that you mentioned of Carlos Bestendorf. Europe has discovered Latin America in '86. Perhaps it is true, and fruit of that is precisely this neo-discovery, which happens in Spain after 1982, and what is more influence from Latin America than from Europe. Parts of the socialist movement was based in Mexico, and then in Europe it was above all in France. I'm sorry for this detour in order to arrive at my question. Sometimes the prologue is longer than the book. The question has to do with a course that we had last week here, Europe and Latin America, or the European Union and Latin America facing the new Trump administration. My question is, in that value exchange and relationships between Latin America and Europe, are we witnessing a new neocolonialism? That's my question. Well, I'm going to make comments on what you said at the beginning, although you made only a question. Although I focused between 87 and 94 in classified documents, I started with a bibliographic revision of official documents from the 50s up until now, in order to make the choice of the period that I consider more important. So one of the reasons why I chose those years is because they help me explain many of the policies that the European Union has had up until now. So that analysis is very much in my mind, even with the many years that have elapsed. As regarding the political moment in Latin America, calls my attention that it was precisely at that time of change and return to democracy, economic crisis and reforms that the European community has included the economic cooperation with Latin American countries, because there is a relation which was clearly asymmetric, not just because the European Union was integrated, whereas the Latin American countries weren't, but also because the economic asymmetry was even more marked in those days. That led me to think the self-coup by Fujimori in '92, because although the discourse said that he had to respect democracy, in the end of the day, what was weightier was the economic interest, because he reformed towards a neoliberal model. And in 1992, when he was told by the European community, convene elections or do something, he didn't convene elections. So the European Union was, or gave up having Latin America as a priority. So what was heavier was the economic side. I don't know whether you have understood well what I was trying to say, but I don't want to say that the European Union was blooming in those days. You may remember what happened between '92 and '93, but I want to give an idea of the inter-regional relations. As to the mutual ignorance, both I and European members of parliament, non-Spaniards, would debate this, and the Spaniards were criticized by I mean, Bestendorf was criticized for what he said, because he said, we already knew Latin America. Simply, I wish to mention that in the '80s, the interparliamentary groups, which were more active. One of them was the South America and the Central America groups. That is very telling of the interest they had. What I mentioned before is that this depended on who the actor was and how much power he has in foreign policy. And there were authors who had interest and knowledge in Latin America. They had traveled to Latin America, but they didn't have the power to make their perspective or translate their perspective into policies. So there was a reinforcement, the Iberian reinforcement, but it doesn't mean that Latin America were totally unknown before. That contradicts what you said before, later in your question or in your prologue, that Europe discovered Latin America. No, that's the same. No, something that I'm missing right now. Anyway, if the idea comes back, I will tell you. And I quote Felipe González in my thesis because I think it is important. I have found two informal norms which are present during my thesis, which is nationality and ideology. Nationality and ideology, in the end, marked how the Euro members of parliament belong to whom they belong. That's why I mentioned Jairo, left and right. When there's something in favor of Latin America, is usually socialists, either German, Portuguese, or Spanish in those days. And then the question about neocolonialism. I go back to what I said at the end. To understand this Latin American critique to the European Union of neocolonialism, one has to think in the time of negotiation. Not only the negotiation of free trade. If we go back to the debt, the Group of Rio experienced the same. Latin Americans wanted to speak about economic topics, but since there was no Plan Baker, and in the end that decided the future of the plan, the Council and the Commission in the meetings tried to avoid the economic topic from the agenda. The agenda was marked by the European Union, and they spoke more of political things than of economic plans. When Plan Baker appears, things change a lot. In the Group of Rio meetings, they start talking more of economics than of the reforms in the region. In fact, I spoke to some of the Latin American diplomats that participated in these meetings, and one told me in the end Spain supported us politically, but at the time of speaking of economic topics, Spain was one among the others because it also had its own economic interests. The Commission at the end of the 80s criticizes the community for not translating discourse into action. The pro-democratic discourse wasn't translated into social rights, etc. Going back to neocolonialism, another example, which I mentioned when I spoke of employment rights, the issue of patents, which is a very wide debate. It is something that us in Latin America observe. It is evident that the European Union is not a united actor, but for the outside, the image works. In Peru, the EU was seen as one and only unit. But in negotiations, when they wanted to remove Bolivia from the agreement because it didn't want to give up in patent issues, a member of parliament was saying, no, let's try and have an international negotiation. But then the representative of the Commission said, no, if it doesn't work, we remove it. So for the civil society, that was also a kind of discovery of how the European Union works. Patents, in the end, were not postponed to 25 years. The European Union was asking even more than the US. And for an Andes country, that meant that prices would multiply by 10 in certain products that were affected by treaties. So from that perspective, one can understand why one of the figures of neocolonialism is seen in the economic area where those interests prevail more than the right to health, which is so basic. And I wanted to say, or to tell you an anecdote, because I think it is important to see the Latin American actors as strategic actors that also have a strategy related to the EU. I worked for a time with indigenous leaders from the whole Andes community, and one of them made a comment. He said, what happens is that now we have to use indigenous because the indigenous are in fashion. So they consciously used that because they knew that the cooperation agencies were looking for projects with those names. So this is something I also wanted to introduce. Questions? Ripussière?
You used sometimes Occidental model, Western solidarity, something like that. How can you manage that kind of concept with European Union and United States? How are you organizing all this?
Okay.
I have a second question. What is the role of Uruguay round negotiation in
Which
the
one?
economic?
Sorry?
Uruguay round negotiation in the field of commercial problems, patents, etc. And the third one, you know, in the Club de Paris, Club de Londres, you had some negotiation about debts.
Yeah.
In that time.
Yeah.
Was it a decision from Europe and United States to separate the subject? And was it the position of Latin American countries to globalize? And I have the last one. You had also discussion about this in G7. Did you saw something about this between all these people?
Actually, one of the main, it's okay if I speak I answer in English. Okay. Actually, one of the main, I have a big part of one chapter that is dedicated to the debt. Why? Because in the books about the Latin American EU relations, the debt is almost never mentioned. But within the archives, is one of the main discussions. It was really important because it didn't become a decision. Doesn't appear in the books, in the literature that we have. So the Paris negotiations, the G7, they were mentioned and they were used by Germany and by Great Britain, saying we have to respect what they are deciding there, because we have to respect the multilateral system and we shouldn't do it just as a community, etc. And actually that sentence, because it was just one sentence while they fought like 2 years, they say we have to be respectful for international the multilateral organizations, that made that they don't include the debt in the dialogue with the Rio group. Mentioning about the negotiations, it's important to notice that to negotiate, it was one bank of the European Union, the EU, European Bank, and then one bank from the US, negotiating with one country. country in debt country, and this make it was again asymmetrical, and that's why there was a Cartagena group, a group from Latin America, that they try to just talk about the debt, and they pursue to talk with the European, with that EC at that point, and that EC didn't, well, not EC, a few actors within the EC, they didn't want that. So I wouldn't say the whole European Union, the whole EC didn't want to open a negotiation or didn't want to include the Latin American thought. It was a consequence of the formal norms that gave power to a few actors to not include them. Actually, within the documents, I found that the Commission was saying the Latin Americans are trying to speak to us as a group, and we are denying them that option. Of course, wasn't the best for the US or the European interests at the point in time. And about solidarity and the Occidental, Western, this is, I didn't put those words. I found this thread within the archives. This is a word that what they were saying in the Commission, for example, or in the Council. That were the words that the delegation were using. That's why I rescued them from there. And especially was used to question or to question the cooperation, to say we cooperate because we want solidarity with these countries. That's why they were using it in this context. Yeah.
I think it's not so simple because you had strong negotiations, some discussion inside the Western group about Latin America. What kind of policy do we have to prove a sort of solidarity and of a global perspective, or do you have to separate? And I think I can give you some references about this because you had this negotiation in the G7 between Reagan, Mitterrand, and others.
Yeah.
And you have long speech about this.
I think.
And Jacques Attali, you can read Jacques Attali.
I think it's actually one of a consequence of my object of study, because I decided to just research the interregional relations. So when I don't see the bilateral relations, I miss those type of things, like what Mitterrand was doing.
Muchas gracias por tantas sugerencias.
Thank you very much for so many suggestions and for such a brave discourse about the role of socialism in Spain. In those years, it was in the government, but you're analyzing until 1994. If I'm not wrong, socialism is until 1996, but in those days they're not that clearly united as at the beginning. I wanted to ask you whether the beginning of rupture of socialism is already noticeable in that discourse, and if it was noticeable in other socialist parties, like for instance the Social Democrats in Germany. The German reality, you must know it much better than me, but I believe it was in the opposition in those days. Perhaps the last years is when their government with the Greens, but in any case that would be the last 2 years. But there is there a relation with the Social Democrats in Germany, or only with the Socialist Party in Spain? The Socialist Party of Spain, you cannot see the change because the interests towards Latin America is smaller at the beginning of the 90s. It is the most important actor, but the comparison of archives in the 80s and in the beginning of the 90s, it is always the Spaniards who speak. At the beginning of the 90s, there are other actors other than the Spaniards who accompany Spaniards. There are authors who speak of a certain decrease of the Spanish interest towards Latin America already at the beginning of the 1990s, in December 1990, for instance. And as to the Social Democrats in Germany, I mentioned it briefly, but there is a difference between Council and Parliament. German European members of Parliament supported the moves towards Latin America, and they knew the region, but that I never found in the German delegation in the Council. I'm sorry, I'm intervening. I'm not in agreement with you. You say that the interest of Spanish socialism towards Latin America, the interregional interest, I think that happened a little later. At least until 1992, it is kept intact. 1992 was the 5th centenary. All cooperation was alive until then. And from then on, it decreases. That's my opinion. I have 2 points to make. First, I say that it decreases quantitatively and qualitatively because members of parliament from Spain decreased their participation on Latin America in the community debate. I can show you that. That's on the one hand. The second, there's another explanation. Spanish policy towards Latin America has three levels: Ibero-American, bilateral, and community level. It may have decreased in one level, but they may have kept other channels of dialogue later. We will talk while during dinner. Luigi. I don't study Latin America, but a few months ago I read a piece of news on the idea of transforming the Latin American Parliament into the Parliament of Latin American and Caribbean states. And from here I discovered that Latin America is the region with the highest number of regional integration projects. So my question is, do you believe that this lack of an only integration project at the regional level may be a stumbling block for the promotion of democracy and of human rights? It is as if the EU didn't have one only actor to which to talk. So there's like an overlap of competences among such a number of regional organizations in Latin America. And besides, I have read, but you know better than me, that the role of governments in those regional organizations is very strong. Almost all these organizations are intergovernmental regions. I beg your pardon, intergovernmental associations or organizations, and there is no one organization which is supranational. I'll start by the last thing. With a piece of luck, they're intergovernmental because it's normally only fora of political dialogue or alliances of an economic nature. If we're lucky, they're intergovernmental because there, as the European experience shows, we are only at the beginnings, and the cooperations with Latin America is for economic reasons. The role of the government is very strong indeed, and this brings an internal problem in Latin America because rank-and-file people don't know that Latin America has had so many integration projects. The first meeting on debt, not the debt of the 80s, but the debt of 120 years, was the first attempt of Latin America coordination in 117 years. So there are millions of attempts. The problem is that Latin America has been characterized by caudillismo, by having a leader with a great personality, the leader. So when Chavez was trying to get the Latin American integration, they were saying, at long last, he's trying to find the Latin American integration. Well, he can say whatever he wants, but this is something we are trying since 1900 or even before. That was the dream of Simón Bolívar. So the lack of knowledge of our own processes makes it easier to use this discourse so that Latin American integration, which is a desire of a common citizen, they have a positive view, is in a way blurred. In the year 2000, the union among countries were motivated by ideological issues. The Pacific Alliance, Mexico, Peru, and Chile and Colombia is an ideological union. The neoliberalism flagships in the region. So what is the future of integration there when the aim is simply an economic objective or goal? Now there are grants among the 4 countries, but there is not necessarily a political will. There's no goal of turning into a strong regional group which can become intergovernmental and then supranational. There's no intention of that type. As to the interlocutor, it is a topic that the European Union has dealt with, and I mentioned it. With whom do we relate? But I also ask myself, why did they choose the Rio group and not the Latin American group, which in those days was trying to get the economic integration of Latin America? Because it wasn't binding. Because if it had been binding, I would say there is a double speech. It is a set of interests. They want a valid interlocutor. They want stability from the European Union. This is based also in their multilateral system, but also there are other interests which will say, still, we want to keep our sovereignty, and whatever we decide there is going to affect us. So this is a more complex thing. But both arguments might be found in the EU or the community in those days. And as to the Latin American Parliament, I saw it from a skeptical point of view. It changes of name every 10, 15 years. And in fact, I would bet for what already exists, which is Mercosur, the Community of the Andes, and the Community of Central American countries. They are the sub-regional groups which are more integrated, and from then start contacts as a whole region. But creating another one is like making a cards or a castle with cards. It is better to work on the basis of what is already institutionalized. That would avoid personalisms. Another question?
Yeah, thank you. I understood you, for your PhD thesis, you interviewed members of the European Parliament from the Interparliamentary Group. The Latin America group in the European Parliament, you interviewed members of the European Parliament there in Brussels.
Yeah, but I decided to not interview European parliaments because I had all their debates, all the things that they were thinking.
The motions for resolutions online, yeah.
Not only the motions for the debates of few days, saying I don't like this, I like this, and notes by hand, and etc.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think speaking with them wouldn't give me what I wanted, because they will give me their political view, what it was already written. So I decided to interview Latin American. It was me. Latin Americans diplomats who were who were negotiating with this with this, well, not only with the EP, but also with delegations on the commission, because they could give me this sense of what they felt, not only rationalized and the political image, but what they were feeling, which were the impressions that they had.
Ask the question.
Yeah.
Thanks. But I think that you're wrong, because especially until the last 2 years ago, there were a lot of members of the European Parliament who were there since the first elections of the European Parliament in 78 or 79. For example, there was a Spanish Martinez. He was also the vice president of the European Parliament. I mentioned him yesterday. So he was really also socialist. He was really active in the European Parliament. And I think that he could give you historical perspective, you know, of the relations between the European Parliament and the Latin America. This is one thing. And the second thing, I think it would be, but now your thesis is over, but maybe for the future research and some maybe future time you come to Brussels and we can meet and and have a drink. But I think it would be also interesting maybe to interview people who work with Latin America in different kind of settings, but in the on a European level. For example, in the Committee of the Regions, but also if you look at the experts in the European Commission, there's a series of people who are experts in everyday dealing with Latin America on different kind of topics. So I think it's also really interesting, and also historically, since they switched, of course, positions, there are a lot of them who've been working on this topic for many years.
I actually, I think that has two answers for why I decided not to include them as well. First, because, for example, Martinez, it never came out in my documents, never. I follow the life of the AP part, like the ones who were speaking the most about Latin America, and like the three that I found the most, they weren't working in the AP anymore. They were one is in Madrid, I think, and the other ones they left politics, so I didn't find them. I follow, because at the beginning, when I was looking for my object of study, I look everywhere. So I even follow all the life of the delegates and the EPs that were more important to me. Then I think it was also a thing about my, okay. I also think that I chose that because I did my thesis in history, although I study political science. And one thing that I found is that there were so many archives. I read around 3,000 documents. So including interviews that maybe they wouldn't give me what I was looking for the audio of my study, didn't make sense. But I have many projects after my thesis. I have so many documents and so many ideas that I had to decide to leave them by the side. Otherwise, I wouldn't never have finished my thesis.
Bueno, es la hora. Si no hay ninguna pregunta.
It is time, so if there is no urgent, important question to finish, I would like to thank Mayte for her presentation. Thank you all for your questions, and we will conclude here our day today.